My name is Eleanor. I'm 52 years old, though I often feel older than my years. My days are steady, predictable, a quiet rhythm that comforts and confines me in equal measure. Mornings begin with a pot of coffee. Afternoons are spent in my tiny garden or lost in the pages of a book, and evenings are quiet, filled with the hum of the world outside my window. I've lived alone since my husband passed nearly a decade ago. Solitude has become my companion, a reliable, if unremarkable, presence in my life. It was on a Tuesday afternoon that my routine shifted, though I didn't know it at the time. The day had started like any other, the late spring air carrying the promise of summer. After a morning tending to my flowers, I decided to treat myself to a slice of cake and coffee at the café down the street. The café was bustling with chatter and clinking cups. I found a small table near the window, my usual spot, and settled in with a well-worn novel. But just as I was about to lose myself in the words on the page, I noticed him. He walked in with an easy confidence, his head held high and his dark hair catching the afternoon light. He couldn't have been older than 30, with a face that seemed to belong in a painting, sharp lines softened by a disarming smile. He had an energy about him that drew the eye, and mine lingered longer than I'd intended. I told myself to focus on my book, to sip my coffee, and mind my business. But something about him stirred a part of me I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just his looks. It was the way he carried himself, the way he seemed to notice the small details in the world around him. When he sat a few tables away, I found myself sneaking glances, watching as he sipped his coffee and scribbled something in a notebook. I was curious, no, captivated. I didn't know why, but he had ignited a spark in me, one I thought had long since burned out. As he left, I caught myself leaning forward, as if to follow him without thinking. My heart raced as I watched him walk down the street, his figure disappearing into the crowd. I stayed in the café a little longer, finishing my coffee in a daze. By the time I returned home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something in me had shifted. And as I lay in bed that night, I made a decision I couldn't explain, even to myself. Tomorrow I would find him. I didn't know what I was searching for, but I knew I couldn't ignore this pull. For the first time in years, I felt alive, restless, curious, and inexplicably drawn to a stranger who had walked into my world and turned it upside down. The next morning, I awoke with a sense of purpose that startled me. I dressed carefully, nothing too bold, just a blouse and my favorite pair of jeans, something casual yet presentable. I told myself it was silly, childish even, but I couldn't deny the flicker of excitement that coursed through me. I returned to the café, hoping for nothing more than a glimpse of him, a confirmation that yesterday hadn't been a dream. I sat in my usual spot by the window, pretending to read while my eyes scanned every face that passed by. It wasn't until I'd nearly given up that I saw him again. He strolled into the café as if he belonged there, that same notebook tucked under his arm. This time, I couldn't tear my eyes away. He ordered his coffee, smiled politely at the barista, and chose a seat near the back. For a moment, I considered leaving. What was I doing? Watching a stranger like this, my heart racing at the mere sight of him. It was absurd. But something rooted me to my chair, a force stronger than reason. I stayed longer than I should have, stealing glances as he wrote in his notebook, occasionally looking out the window as if lost in thought. When he finally stood to leave, I hesitated. And then, almost without thinking, I followed him. It wasn't a decision I made consciously. My feet moved before my mind caught up, and soon I found myself trailing him down the street. He walked with purpose, weaving through the crowd with a grace I envied. I kept my distance, careful not to be seen, though the thought of him turning around sent a thrill of fear and exhilaration through me. He stopped at a park, settling on a bench near the fountain. From a distance, I watched as he scribbled in his notebook again, occasionally glancing up at the children playing or the pigeons fluttering nearby. Over the next 3 days, this became a pattern. I followed him from the café to the park, and once, to a small bookstore where he spent nearly an hour browsing the shelves. I felt like a character in one of my novels, living out a story far removed from the life I'd known. I learned small details about him. The way he lingered over his coffee, the titles of the books he chose, the way his lips curled into a faint smile when he found something amusing. But more than anything, I was trying to understand why he had such an effect on me. I told myself it was harmless, that I was simply curious. Yet, each day I grew more entangled in this quiet obsession, caught between the fear of discovery and the undeniable thrill of being near him. By the third evening, as I sat in my living room replaying every moment, a realization began to take shape. There were moments, small, fleeting ones, when I thought he might have noticed me too. A lingering glance as he left the café, a faint smile when he passed me on the street. Was it possible? Could he feel it too, this inexplicable pull between us? The thought both terrified and exhilarated me. And for the first time, I wondered if I was ready to find out. On the fourth morning, I stepped into the café with a nervous energy that was impossible to ignore. I wasn't sure if I hoped to see him or feared it. My heart had been a steady drumbeat of anticipation since the night before, and I could barely focus on the world around me. I ordered my coffee, sitting in the same spot by the window, pretending to read. But my mind wasn't on the book. I scanned the room until my eyes landed on him. He was there, sitting at his usual table near the back, his notebook open and his pen resting lightly between his fingers. For the first time, he looked up and caught my gaze. It wasn't just a glance. It lingered, a second or two longer than politeness required. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Was it a coincidence? Or had he noticed me before, as I dared to imagine? I quickly dropped my gaze, pretending to focus on my book, but my mind was spinning. When I glanced up again, I caught him watching me, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. My heart pounded in my chest, a wild and unfamiliar rhythm. After he finished his coffee, he stood and walked toward the door. I thought he'd leave without another glance, but just as he passed me, he paused. "Excuse me," he said, his voice warm and unexpectedly soft. I looked up, startled, as he gestured toward my book. "Is it any good?" For a moment, I couldn't speak. Words failed me entirely. But then I managed to nod, holding the book up as if to show him the cover. It's one of my favorites." His smile widened, a flash of something kind and curious in his eyes. "Good to know. Maybe I'll have to read it sometime." And just like that, he was gone, leaving me sitting there with my heart racing and my hands trembling around the book. The rest of the day passed in a haze. That small exchange replayed in my mind on an endless loop. It wasn't much, just a few words, but it felt like a bridge had been built, something delicate and tentative, yet undeniable. The next day, I didn't follow him. I couldn't bring myself to. Instead, I waited at the cafe, wondering if he'd show up again, wondering if that moment had meant as much to him as it did to me. When he walked in, he glanced around the room, and this time, his eyes went straight to me. He smiled, that same easy warmth that made me feel as though the air had thickened between us. He sat at his usual table, but every so often, I felt his gaze drift toward me. It wasn't my imagination. There was something there, a glimmer of connection, as though the universe had quietly conspired to place us in each other's orbit. By the end of that day, I knew I couldn't keep pretending this was chance. Something was unfolding between us, something fragile, yet undeniable. And I would need to decide whether I had the courage to take the next step. The decision didn't come easily. For 2 nights, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, grappling with the storm of emotions swirling within me. What was I doing? What did I expect? I was a 52-year-old woman, well past the age of foolish fantasies. And yet, this felt different, like a spark of life in a soul that had long been dormant. When I saw him again at the cafe, I knew I couldn't let this strange, beautiful possibility slip away. He was sitting in his usual spot, sipping his coffee and jotting something into his notebook. He looked up as I entered, his eyes meeting mine instantly, as if he had been waiting for me. I hesitated for only a moment before summoning every ounce of courage I had. Instead of sitting at my table by the window, I walked directly to his. My heart was hammering in my chest, and my palms were clammy, but I forced myself to stand tall. Do you mind if I join you? I asked, my voice steady despite the whirlwind inside me. He blinked in surprise but quickly smiled, gesturing to the chair across from him. Not at all. Please. As I sat down, the world seemed to blur around us. We talked about books, the café, the little things that made life interesting. His name was Adrian, and he was 29. He spoke with an enthusiasm that made me feel younger, as though I was rediscovering the simple joy of conversation. When I told him my name and my age, I expected the usual reaction, a polite nod, a flicker of discomfort, but instead, he leaned forward, his eyes genuinely curious. You have such a peaceful energy about you, he said. It's rare to meet someone who feels so grounded. His words struck something deep within me, and I knew then that this wasn't just a passing infatuation. There was something real here, something I couldn't ignore. As the afternoon turned to evening, I knew the moment was approaching. I could feel it in the way our conversation lingered, in the way his smile softened when he looked at me. Would you like to come over for dinner? The words left my mouth before I could overthink them. My heart was pounding, and I couldn't believe I'd been so bold. He seemed surprised but not uneasy. I'd love to, he said, his voice warm and steady. We walked to my home together, the air thick with an unspoken understanding. My thoughts raced, oscillating between excitement and doubt. Was this a mistake? Would he see me differently under the soft light of my home, away from the cozy anonymity of the café? When we arrived, I busied myself in the kitchen, preparing a simple meal while he explored my living room, admiring the bookshelves and the small paintings that lined the walls. This place feels like you, he said when I joined him. It's comfortable, like a place you'd want to stay. His words melted my fears, and as we sat down to eat, I felt the walls around my heart begin to lower. It wasn't just the wine or the soft glow of the candles. It was him, his presence, his kindness, the way he made me feel seen. When dinner was over, I offered him coffee, hoping to prolong the evening. He accepted, and as we sat on the couch, the conversation shifted, growing quieter, more intimate. I don't remember who leaned in first, but when our lips met, it was like the world stopped. For the first time in years, I felt alive, completely, breathtakingly alive. The kiss was soft at first, a tentative meeting of two worlds that had been inching closer with every glance and every word. But as the seconds passed, the hesitation melted away. His hand rested lightly on my cheek, the warmth of his touch sending shivers down my spine. I pulled back for a moment, my breath hitching as I looked into his eyes. Are you sure? I whispered, my voice trembling with vulnerability. He didn't answer with words. Instead, he leaned in again, his lips finding mine with a certainty that quieted every doubt. In that moment, the years between us disappeared, leaving only the raw, undeniable connection we had forged. The rest of the evening unfolded like a dream, slow, deliberate, and deeply intimate. He was attentive, as if he wanted to memorize every detail of who I was. His touch was gentle but firm, his presence both grounding and exhilarating. For the first time in years, I felt beautiful, not in a fleeting, surface-level way, but in a way that reached down to the core of who I was. We moved together as if we'd known each other for lifetimes, the rhythm of our connection unspoken, yet perfectly understood. Every moment was layered with emotion, each kiss and caress carrying an unspoken promise of acceptance. At one point, I caught sight of my reflection in the glass of the window. My hair was mussed, my face flushed, but what struck me most was the look in my eyes. It was something I hadn't seen in years, an unguarded, radiant joy. Afterward, we lay tangled together on the couch, the soft glow of the candles casting shadows across the room. His head rested on my shoulder, his hand tracing lazy circles on my arm. I stared at the ceiling, my thoughts a whirlwind of disbelief and gratitude. I never expected this, I murmured, my voice barely audible. Neither did I, he admitted, lifting his head to look at me. But sometimes, the best things in life are the ones we don't see coming. I smiled, my fingers brushing against his cheek. You've brought something back to me, Adrian. something I thought I'd lost a long time ago. He didn't respond with words. Instead, he pulled me closer, his embrace warm and steady, as if he understood exactly what I meant. The night stretched on, filled with quiet conversations and comfortable silences. There was no rush, no need to define what we were or where this would lead. For now, it was enough to simply be, to bask in the warmth of a connection that felt as natural as breathing. By the time the first light of dawn filtered through the curtains, I knew my life would never be the same. Something profound had shifted, and I wasn't sure where it would lead. But for the first time in years, I felt ready to follow it. Wherever it might take me, the days that followed were a blur of warmth, laughter, and moments that felt suspended in time. Adrian and I grew closer with every passing hour, as though the universe had decided that we were meant to cross paths, regardless of the years between us or the expectations we'd once held for our lives. But even in the midst of this joy, doubts crept in. There were the quiet voices of reason, society's expectations, the judgments that came with our age difference, the fear of what others might think. Yet, with each touch, with each smile, those fears seemed less important. One afternoon, as I sat by the window looking out over the street below, I found myself thinking about love, how it comes and goes, how it changes us. When I was younger, I thought love would always be this bright, all-consuming fire. But now, in my 50s, I had come to understand love in a different way, a quiet, steady flame that burns with depth and meaning, even if it doesn't burn as hot. Adrian had reminded me that love wasn't confined to the pages of romance novels or the illusions of youth. Love could happen at any age, and it could be even more profound than anything we had imagined. I was no longer a woman who had forgotten how to feel. I was someone who had rediscovered the beauty of connection. I found myself reflecting on how much I had changed since we first met. I had been closed off, resigned to a life of routine, my heart encased in layers of practicality and caution. But Adrian had broken through those walls, gently and persistently, until I could no longer hide from what my heart had longed for. As I stood in my kitchen preparing dinner for the two of us, I realized something. The fear I had once felt about aging, about being past my prime, had been replaced with something else. I had finally learned that age was just a number. The true measure of our lives isn't in how many years we've lived, but in the depth of our experiences, the richness of the connections we've made, and the courage to open our hearts, no matter where we are in life. When Adrian arrived that evening, he kissed me as if nothing had changed, because nothing had, except for the way we looked at each other, the understanding that had settled between us. He had become a part of my world in ways I hadn't expected, and in doing so, he had made me whole again. "I've been thinking," I said as we sat down to eat. "I never thought I would experience something like this again. But I think that's what love does. It surprises you." He smiled, his hand finding mine across the table. "Love doesn't have an expiration date," he said softly. "It's timeless, just like us." In that moment, I realized that our connection wasn't just a fleeting spark, it was something deeper, something that had shifted the trajectory of my life. I had rediscovered a part of myself that had been buried under the weight of time and fear. And I wasn't willing to let go of it, not now, not ever. With Adrian, I had found something more precious than I could have ever anticipated, a love that transcended age, societal expectations, and the limitations I had placed on myself. It was a reminder that it's never too late to follow your heart, to take risks, and to embrace the unexpected. And as I leaned in to kiss him, the future no longer seemed uncertain. It was ours to create, one day at a time.